Adriana, take it away.
All right, thank you. This weird spy microphone. So I was sad not to be able to hear Taryn's talk, which I think was on holy ambition and vocation. And then Maura asked me last night if I would give a talk instead. And luckily I give a lot of talks at school to like formal assemblies that we have for our students. So both Amanda and I, who teach at the same school, have like several of these just kind of lined up. So I just printed one out that I've used before and I'll give it to you. What's kind of interesting though is that I think a lot of the lessons that you can draw from Joseph Dutton's life are actually similar to what I think are some of the points maybe that Taryn would have made in her talk about vocation and ambition. So it actually kind of streamlined really nicely. The other nice thing about this talk, I kind of do a trade-off with you. I am going to read from something that I wrote and printed off. But the consolation to that is that I wrote this for 200 hungry teenagers in the period right before lunch. So it is not that long because I can't keep their attention. And because it's written, you know exactly when it will end and you can watch me put the pages down and you'll know exactly where we are at every time. So it's nice. Okay. So thank you for listening to me read for that in exchange for that trade-off. Okay. So I'm always really excited to talk about this guy, even at the drop of a hat. He's somebody that I heard about a couple of years ago by going down a Wikipedia rabbit hole. I think I was just learning about Father Damien, who I think a lot of you are probably familiar with, St. Damien of Moloka'i, who was canonized within the last 20 years or so. He's canonized by Benedict XVI. And he was a Belgian priest who worked and lived in a colony for leprosy patients in Hawaii for several years. I think he was there about 13 or 14 years before he died, also of leprosy or complications from it. So I knew about him, and I knew about Mother Marian Cope, whose feast day actually was not anywhere near now. I don't know why I thought it was like April. Oh, sorry. I was thinking of her for a different reason. But yeah, they were companions there at Moloka'i. And then when I was reading about them, I saw on the Wikipedia pages highlighted, hyperlinked, named Joseph Dutton, and I had never heard that before, so I clicked on that, and then I think hours later was done going down this rabbit hole, and pretty much read everything there was to read about him online, because there's not very much, right? And then I kind of started to look into him more. Discovered that he's a servant of God. His cause for canonization is open. And within the Diocese of Honolulu, he's very well known, but he's not very well known at all outside of that. So I dug into him a little bit more, and I was really compelled by what I heard and by what I read, and I've been kind of more compelled the more that I've learned. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about his life tonight, and I have a lot of photographs to share with you there. Okay, so here we go. One morning in July 1930, a ship docked in Honolulu, and a sailor carried an old, exhausted man to shore. He was mostly deaf, mostly blind, with a white beard and little spectacles. To the people going about their business that day, he wouldn't have seemed like anyone remarkable, a small, helpless figure in a stronger man's arms. If anyone's gaze lingered on him for more than a moment, it was probably out of pity. If they turned away, perhaps it was from a discomfort with his weakness. But many, I'm sure, never noticed him as he was brought to the hospital where he would spend his final months. His name was Joseph Dutton. He had been living on a remote peninsula on the neighboring island of Moloka'i. In fact, he had not left it for almost 50 years, until his failing health demanded that he be brought back to the mainland. When he was last in Honolulu back in 1886, he had been in the prime of his life. He had arrived fresh from the United States to talk with the Hawaiian Minister of Health, specifically to ask permission to work in the notorious colony on Moloka'i, where people with leprosy lived in government-mandated exile. Thank you, Mara. My bad eyes appreciate it. The minister was surprised at Dutton's request, because very few people you can imagine ever asked to go to a leper colony. Right? But he granted him permission and asked how much he expected to be paid for his services. Dutton said not to pay him. The minister suggested that they work out a contract in case he changed his mind later, and Dutton declined. Shortly thereafter, to the consternation of all these people around him, he departed by boat from Moloka'i to work for the rest of his life without a paycheck, in a job most people would not take for all the money in the world. If you know Dutton's story, you can understand much better the motivations that would drive him to make that decision. Even by the age of 40, which is how old he was when he departed from Moloka'i, he had worn many hats. He was a Union Army veteran, an abandoned husband, a recovering alcoholic, a Catholic convert, an attempted monk, and a restless wanderer. He would have just said he was a sinner. But here in Hawaii, he was to add to that list a nurse, a carpenter, a friend to saints, a comfort to the dying, and a father to orphans. And still a sinner, but a holier one. It is not a little baffling that an ordinary man from rural Vermont transplanted himself here, to a place he had never even heard of growing up. Of all the lonely, isolated spots on Earth, he made his way to this colony, once referred to as a living graveyard. We have to wonder what happened to him. Perhaps not least of all from an unconscious desire to know if such a thing could happen to us. Okay. So first, a little context, just from the background here. Leprosy, which is known in medicine as Hansen's disease, came to Hawaii in the early 1800s. Over the previous decades leading up to that, the kingdom had become a destination for foreign merchants, planters, and sailors, and as they arrived, so did their diseases, which is a familiar story to us as Americans. As a result, the native population of Hawaii plummeted to less than 25% of its numbers from a century earlier. That means that in 100 years, 3 out of 4 Hawaiians died. Oddly enough, of those many diseases, leprosy is by far the least contagious, but it would be a long time until doctors discovered that or found any way to reliably treat the condition. We know now that most people are naturally resistant to leprosy. It's something like among European populations, something like 90 to 95% of people are naturally immune to leprosy. It means that no matter how much you're exposed, you'll never get it. The statistics are a little lower among Native Hawaiians, but not by much. So even a vulnerable person has to spend long amounts of time with a patient in order to contract the disease, and it may take many years after that for any symptoms to appear whatsoever. Also, armadillos carry it, so don't hug armadillos. Once is fine. Many times, maybe not. The CDC article on that is one of my favorite CDC articles anyway. Okay, I want to calm all these people worried about armadillos. Okay, so still, all these facts which reassure us now served only to make leprosy seem more random and frightening to the people of the mid-19th century. And that fear goes back to biblical times. You're very familiar with that. The Hawaiian kingdom's solution to that outbreak was swift, severe, and relatively simple. It was to put people in exile. So starting in the 1860s, the government's policy, and at that time Hawaii was its own kingdom, was not yet part of the United States, took men, women, and children away from their families by police order and stranded them on a remote peninsula on the otherwise well-populated island of Moloka'i. This peninsula, called Kalapapa, or Flat Leaf, so this is the island of Moloka'i. This is all actually pretty populated. It's the second largest island in the Hawaiian archipelago, so you can go to all these places. This is the part that we're talking about, right? It's called Kalapapa, or Flat Leaf, and it's a peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides and a 2,000 to 3,000 foot cliff on the other. It's the largest such sea cliff in the world. Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island, called it a prison fortified by nature. Right? So that's it, seen from the air. But in less poetic terms, one resident said, this was hell. It was here that over the next century, 8,000 patients would live out their exile, not all at one time, but over the course of that century. At first, there was little help given to those dropped off on Kalapapa. Even though they were very ill, they were expected to care for themselves, an impossible task for people suffering from nerve damage, numbness in their limbs, loss of vision. Leprosy itself actually isn't fatal on its own, but it does leave a person more vulnerable to myriad diseases, infections, and complications. And so many of these, most actually of these early exiles died not long after arriving on Kalapapa. So from the first, the situation in the colony was desperate, not only physically, but spiritually. Despair was as devastating as any other disease that they faced. And so the place rightly earned the nickname the Living Graveyard. And even to this day, you can't really visit it now, but even to this day, it's just kind of full of just stretches of fields filled with graves. And this was 1866 when the first people arrived. So that same year, thousands of miles away, here in the United States of America, a war had just ended. So the millions of men who had endured the Civil War had finally laid down their guns. One of them was Ira Dutton, our old man from earlier. But he was young then. He was 22 when the war broke out, and he had fought on the Union side for Wisconsin. Naturally patriotic, an organized worker, and a good leader, he had not seen much actual fighting, but the war had given him a chance to show off his administrative talents. He was by all accounts an ordinary, good, unremarkable man who, before the war, had worked in a bookshop and taught Sunday school for his Protestant church. And then, on January 1st, 1866, he writes, he made the first major mistake of his life. He got married. It's a little harsh, but those are his words, not mine. Her name was Louisa, a name which I had to hunt down in Ohio marriage records because he never mentioned it in any of his correspondence ever. His friends had warned him about her. They said that she had a reputation for infidelity. But, and years later, Dutton himself admitted he could not understand what he had wanted or hoped for from this marriage, but he knew that he had been hoping to achieve some good and to help her in some way. but he could not help her. And about a year after their marriage, having spent much of Dutton's money, she ran off with another man to New York. He never saw her again. As best I can tell, he never heard from her again. He never remarried, never had children. He waited 15 years before he even officially divorced her, a fact announced in a tiny blurb in a small town newspaper for whoever cared at that point to read it. Dutton's life from those early days on became kind of a tangle of joys and sorrows. I said that he referred to that marriage as a mistake, but in the same paragraph, he also calls it the knot that was to do and undo wonders. And he adds, perhaps it was the best help I ever had. I wish he had explained what he meant by this, but it's worth mentioning that in his later life, after he became Catholic, he often requested to have masses said for her, though he likely had no idea where she was or even if she were still living. In this way, I believe he did accomplish his desire to help her, and he himself knew that his mistake was not a meaningless one. In the moment, though, the abandonment was catastrophic for him. This was the first step in a long downward spiral that he called his degenerate decade. It didn't help that his job at the time was to travel to battlefields, exhume dead soldiers from their shallow graves, and transport them to national cemeteries for reburial. This sort of work would have a morbid influence on the happiest person, let alone a man going through a major life crisis. And he estimates that he reburied about 5,000 people, 5,000 or 6,000 bodies. His own words describe it best. He writes, "While I was burying the dead, what I had in life was cast adrift, and I drifted." He relaxed his ambition to live a good life, to adhere to a moral code, to worship the God he had known in his youth, and he began to drink. Despite his growing dependence on alcohol, he was unusually high functioning and writes that his nighttime habits hardly affected his daytime work, which is something that most alcoholics do not experience, but some do. He had a glowing record in the jobs that he held in that decade. Privately, however, he was falling apart. After the cemetery job, the first work he found was through an army friend who invited him to join an unspecified business venture, and Dutton agreed to this blindly. When he traveled to Tennessee to begin work, he found he had agreed to run a whiskey distillery. So this man, whose chief strength was his thoroughness, now applied himself with dangerous thoroughness to this task. Working nights there, he slipped into full-blown alcoholism. This is how he remembered those years looking back. So I'll read this. Before then, he says, I had never seen the inside of a distillery. In fact, I have not, to this day, seen either the inside or the outside, save that in Kentucky and some other states. While passing by, I've seen some buildings I presume were distilleries. Yet this one almost infernal exception, this making of a deep notch in my record, this one distillery amongst the pine hills, pine tops, pine knots, a deep mark, a notch cut as with the wild slash of a knife in a reckless hand. This one distillery is a burning and biting exception. Yet I do not actually regret, not as with worrying sorrow. It was detestable, but has not good come of it? I believe so, and hope for more. I had been off track since muster out from the army, off the sensible fair track anyway, and more was needed for my lesson. I had it there, more and more. My strength was expended in a grim eagerness for work, never stopping, making the night run, doing the yeasting and the mashing, sleeping hardly more than an hour at a time, taking a medium drink of whiskey every hour. These days he would later call the smash in reference to one of the jobs he did at the distillery. For a moment, we'll leave him there and turn our attention back to Hawaii. While Dutton was becoming a soldier and then an alcoholic, another man was becoming a priest and a missionary. And this is one character in the story that you probably know, St. Damien de Voister. Father Damien was the best-known member of a class of people called the kokua, or helpers, who arrived at Kalaupapa voluntarily. Many kokua were family members of patients with leprosy, parents or spouses. Others knew nobody on the island but came there out of charity, and Father Damien was one of these. His presence in the colony brought both spiritual nourishment and physical progress, as he helped the patients improve their living conditions. He built churches, homes, and hospitals, raised orphans, gave the last sacraments, cleaned and dressed their wounds. He was a doctor to their bodies and their souls, quickly throwing aside all precautions the diocese had advised him to take in terms of distance from the patients. And on average, he said he dug one grave a day. I could give another entire talk about Father Damien, how he came to Hawaii all the way from Belgium, how he slept and said Mass under a palm tree for the first 3 weeks in Kalaupapa because there was no house for him, how he used to sit and pray in the graveyard because he liked to think about the joys of heaven that his deceased friends were experiencing. But you can read plenty about him on their own. There's been much ink spilled on Father Damien. You can also read about St. Marianne Cope, who brought, that's not her. Oh my goodness, so many pictures. There she is. She brought 6 of her nuns from New York to Kalaupapa and served alongside Father Damien. She promised her sisters they would never get leprosy, and they never did. Because of their efforts and the efforts of many other anonymous heroes, the spiritual wasteland began to come to life. It became simultaneously a place of deep suffering and deep community in a very mysterious way. One of Damien's most important efforts was simply to do all things in common with his patients. He ate with them, sang with them, treated them. In other words, everything you're not supposed to do if you want to avoid getting leprosy. But he thought the benefits of his spiritual and emotional closeness to them outweighed the risks to his body. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, Ira Dutton had found a few kokua of his own. On July 4th, 1876, the 100th anniversary of American independence, he declared his independence from alcohol. He wrote about this years later with a healthy dose of humor at his own expense. He writes, "After a drunken spree that tried the patience of everyone around me, I figured out that in 15 years, I had drunk 15 barrels of whiskey. I thought it was fully my share, perhaps a little over, and that I was not entitled to any more. And no more it has been until this day. It has not caused me a moment of regret or desire. My nerves are all right, and there must be something left in the jug of goodwill." With the ravages of addiction moving off, he began to think of God again, as he had not done seriously in years. In the calm that followed his wild decade, his first desire was for penance, kind of overwhelming desire for penance, to try to make up in some way for the harm that he'd done to himself and the years of his life that he'd wasted. Then, through the influence of some kind Catholic friends, he found an answer in the church. And on his 40th birthday, he became a Catholic and took the new name Joseph after his favorite saint. From that day on, he wandered, searching for a life of penance and not sure where to find it. He joined a Trappist monastery in Kentucky, the Gethsemane Abbey, which Thomas Merton would later belong to, where he lived their simple life for 2 years before deciding that it was not the path for him. He felt he needed to take on some kind of active outward service, which the Trappists don't typically do. He wandered a bit more and ended up in New Orleans, where he came across an article in a magazine one day. It was about Father Damien. The article described the work of the heroic priest, who at that point had been in Kalaupapa for a decade, with no breaks and too little help. Dutton also learned that Father Damien had contracted leprosy himself, and he was dying. Something clicked in Dutton's mind. He sold what he had, and took a steamer ship to Hawaii. Didn't even write to Father Damien beforehand. He landed first in Honolulu, as I mentioned earlier, got the necessary permissions from the government and the diocese, and boarded one of the rare mail boats out to Kalaupapa. I should say that he did go and talk to a professor at Notre Dame that he knew well, who had written this article that he read, just to basically go ask him whether Father Damien would need his help, whether he'd be needed, because it's kind of hard to get a hold of someone who lives that far away. And the professor told him, yes, he couldn't say for sure, but he would think that Father Damien would accept his help. And what's funny is when I did some research at Notre Dame on Dutton, because a lot of his letters are now there. And in one edition of their kind of weekly paper, they used to do this thing they don't do anymore, where like if there had been a kind of visitor to campus, South Bend, I presume there are not a lot of people that were visiting the campus at that time. But they would have a log of like, these 5 people came to campus this week, right? And here's where they're from and here's why they were here. And he put as his address, like where he was from, he put the Sandwich Islands, was his Hawaii. He had not been there yet. But like, that's how confident he was that he was going there, right? He's like, I'm Joseph Dutton from Hawaii, right? Like, what's going on, man, right? Anyway, very confident. So he went. When he docked there, a man in a wide-brimmed hat was waiting by the pier, as he always was on those days when boats arrived. Oh, sorry, that's Gethsemane. That was, this is Father Damien when he arrived, and this was him at the time that Dutton knew him. This is the year that he died. That's the landing area outside of Kalaupapa. Ships usually kept a great distance, and you went the rest of the way on rowboat. That's the pier. Dutton took one look at the man with his black clothing and disfigured face and knew that it was Father Damien. He stepped on shore and introduced himself, saying, "My name is Joseph Dutton. I've come to work and I've come to stay." Father Damien accepted him with no questions. From that day on, he called him Brother Joseph, explaining how he'd begged his own religious order to send him more brothers for years, and he considered Dutton an answer to that prayer, even if he wasn't part of any monastic community. Funnily enough, Father Damien's name had been Joseph before he entered religious life. And the two men liked each other from the start, allowing Dutton to get to work right away. Thus he became a kokua, and he wouldn't leave the island again until he was dying of old age. At first, Dutton learned the ropes alongside Father Damien. Oh, there we go. Sorry, can you tell it's been a year since I gave this talk? Okay. He was taught to dress wounds, make patients comfortable, give medical advice, construct and repair buildings, manage supplies, run Father Damien's orphanage, coach baseball, and pray. In some ways, it was a punishing lifestyle. He slept very little on a kind of wooden shelf and lived on next to nothing. But he was happy, and more importantly, he was at peace. His contentment and calm were two of the things Father Damien most valued in him. He had arrived just in time, as Father Damien's condition was deteriorating. In Lent of 1889, about 3 years after Dutton's arrival, the priest finally became bedridden. He was hardly recognizable as the same man who'd arrived in Kalaupapa 15 years before. Dutton was by his side as often as possible, dressing the saint's wounds himself, as Father Damien had become quite helpless, as he remembered. Dutton also remembered that he was patient and resigned and thinking of the future. Several times when we were alone, Dutton writes, he asked me what day he would die. I always said Palm Sunday. And he wanted me to move into his house as soon as he was gone. Father Damien drew great peace from the prospect of Dutton's future leadership, saying, I can die now. Brother Joseph will take care of my orphans. On the last day of Father Damien's life, Dutton had a photograph taken of him and thought it was the best of any pictures that existed of the priest. When I look at it, I get the feeling I could contemplate these photos for the rest of my life and always find something new. So this is the photo actually that Dutton refers to, that he had copied and sent out. I'll go to the previous one in a minute and explain that. In it, Father Damien is propped up on his deathbed, and the stark contrast of colors in the photo highlights the deformities of his hands, which had offered the Eucharist so many times. His face reveals the depths of his last exhaustion. Somewhere off camera, we know Joseph Dutton is contemplating his friend in that moment, because from his letters, we know that he was the one who helped arrange this photograph, right? That he was there. And actually, I know that he was there because I think that's him. That was a kind of throwaway photo. So the other one was the one that he had duplicated and kind of sent out, but this is another archival photo, and I think that that's him getting Damien ready for the photograph. Now, Father Damien died, but not on Palm Sunday, early the next morning. Dutton writes that. He's like, I told him Palm Sunday, and actually it looked like he was going to die on Palm Sunday, and then he rallied and died very early the next morning, right? Maybe just to prove him wrong, I don't know. He was buried next to the tree under which he had slept when he arrived at Kalaupapa. Dutton carefully recorded all of these details, saved palm leaves from Father Damien's grave, and had the picture duplicated. He also sent pieces of Damien's cape and his stole. I got to touch his stole because it's at Notre Dame, and they'll bring it out in an archive box for you. And the guy gave me this really weird look. He just kind of put it in front of me, and I was like, "Can I touch it?" And he was like, "Sure." And I was like, "That's the only reason I wanted you to bring it out, really. I mean, it looks very normal, but I was like, it's a relic, so I want to touch it." And then he put it away. So all right. Anyway. So he sent all these things out to friends and to people. He knew that Damien was a saint. Okay, so then, as asked, he moved into Father Damien's house and he got right back to work because really there was no other choice. That's him with the memorial. Okay. So now the next, final, and longest stretch of Dutton's work began. 4 decades without Father Damien's help and companionship. Strangely, of all the chapters in his life, I have the least to say about this one, because it was the least tumultuous, the most rhythmic, the most silent, the most mundane. Most of his letters are just about, please buy me this, here's a receipt for this, right? It's the least interesting to you and I, but the most important because of what was going on between Dutton and God. Day after day, this man and his Lord worked out together the debts of his old sins. On this forsaken island, Dutton let the pain of past mistakes wash away. His feeling about them softened. God forgave him, and he forgave himself as well. I think of this time in his life as being like a field after a storm. Maybe the thunder and lightning were more dramatic and interesting, but there's a quiet profundity, clarity, and freshness to the time after the storm. The clean air and the rich earth beginning to bring forth new life again. Most beautifully, Dutton became now what his marriage had never made him, a father. Except instead of a few biological children, he had hundreds of adopted ones. Young boys, taken from their parents, became his foster sons. And he loved them dearly, as a man who loved St. Joseph could do. Where is he? He's in the center there, with the dramatic beard, and then everybody's around it. I could tell you all sorts of other things about these years. He kept in touch with countless friends in the United States. He got 50-pound bags of mail sometimes when boats came in. Legend has it he kept more than 4,000 addresses. And frequently, after a long day's work, he stayed up into the early morning hours writing letters. I think some of my favorite writing of his was produced in those late sessions. My absolute favorite letter is one he says he wrote to a lady at 3:30 in the morning in the middle of a heavy storm. It wasn't long after the death of Father Damien, so Dutton had just taken on some heavy burdens. I think this was 2 or 3 months after Damien's death. He was replying to a friend who had expressed her great admiration for his work, and she said she wished she could do something to help him, or wished she could join him and dress the sores herself. Right? And here's what he wrote. Before I forget, I wish to guard you against having too high an estimate of the work here. Work performed with a good intention to accomplish the will of Almighty God is the same in one place as in another. One's Moloka'i can be anywhere. At the same time, the many things that have led to my life here now appear to me clearly the action of divine providence in my behalf. Yet I find no repugnance, no great trial. You doubtless have greater ones. And he finishes with this. To be sure, the life is given eventually, and the body to rottenness, but it must rot anyway. When he was in his late 80s and his health was failing, he consented to leave Kalaupapa for the first time since he had arrived there. He departed by the same pier where he had met Father Damien. It was July 4th, the anniversary of his sobriety, which had been his first step back to a life of virtue. He was brought to the hospital at Honolulu, where he lived his last months. At first, he expected to be treated and then released back to the colony, but it soon became clear he would not get better. It was a bittersweet realization. It may be, he said, that God brought all this about. Perhaps it was he who ordered I should cease my work and be taken to a place where I might have peace and quiet without worry. I have been very comfortable and contented. No, I don't think I shall ever go back. But Kalaupapa was never far out of his mind. I wonder how it looks after all these months, he said on one occasion. He died at 2 o'clock in the morning, his usual letter-writing time, on March 26, 1931, having lived 44 years wandering in the world and 44 years dressing sores in Kalaupapa. He was, and still is, buried next to Damien's grave in the little churchyard. Though even Damien is gone, his relics have been transferred back to his native Belgium. I think his hand is still left in that grave. But even they're gone, and Dutton is still there. Because Dutton himself would have wanted to know, I can tell you briefly what's happened to Kalaupapa since then. It's kind of the last brief part of the talk. After World War II, so really only a decade or two after Dutton, medical understanding of leprosy began to progress very quickly. Sorry, this is the rock on Kalaupapa. A regimen of antibiotics was developed with remarkable results, and today leprosy is considered quite treatable, especially if caught early. As a result, government-mandated exile to Kalaupapa ended, finally, in 1969, after 103 years of suffering, sacrifice, and community, 1 century and several saints later. Many residents actually chose to remain in Kalaupapa after the Segregation Act was lifted, especially those who had arrived as children and knew no other life, had no one else on the mainland. Conditions had improved hand and fist over what Father Damien had seen when he arrived, and as antibiotics became available, a lot of their sufferings, or at least some of them, decreased. The patients maintained a vibrant and close-knit fellowship through the decades. Today, just 2 patients remain, and discussions are ongoing what will happen to that property. I think it's now designated a national park, but it's actually forbidden for people to visit there. Otherwise, I would be on a plane tomorrow, right? But it's, yeah, you really can't get there. There are just no facilities. As for Joseph Dutton, his cause for canonization moved forward just 5 months ago. So one day he may be declared a saint, sharing that honor with St. Damien and St. Marian Cope. But the thought I'd like to leave you with is the one that Dutton expressed in the letter above. Do I have this on a slide? I don't, but that's a cool one. That passage that he wrote, the life is given eventually and the body to rottenness, but it must rot anyway. It's a strange passage. It seems fitting for a person whose job at one time was to rebury bodies, and then who lived most of his life among people who were sort of visibly decaying, right? It's a kind of gross image to us, but I think for him it was very fitting. It reminds us of how in our culture we're so often timid and reluctant to choose a way in which to spend our lives, to choose to be depleted, to choose to have some kind of work chip away at us, because we don't like the idea of our lives being spent. Choice, which limits us, reminds us of our mortality. And so we get this strange idea that if we never choose anything wholeheartedly, maybe we'll put off the inevitable. But Dutton insists that our lives are always being given at every moment. So what will we give them to? In the eyes of the world, Dutton and Father Damien gave their bodies over to suffering and to rottenness. But they would rot anyway. And what a rest they found as a result. So let's not be afraid. Asking for Joseph Dutton's prayers, let's give our lives with the same embarrassing generosity. Thank you.